Hello and welcome everyone. So in this video, I'm going to talk about the last three sections from the Wages and Workers chapter. So the first one, institutional factors, then discrimination, then personnel economics. All right, so firstly, we want to think about the ways that governments impact the labor market. So one area is through affecting labor supply through licensing laws. So the basic idea with licensing laws is to make it difficult to be able to enter a particular industry. So you can have an example of like medicine or law, where you have, doctors have to be board certified, attorneys have to pass the bar. And so in a lot of cases, this could be argued on the grounds of trying to benefit customers, maintaining a certain level of quality for those who are in those particular jobs. Sometimes incumbents, those who are currently in the position, are going to argue for some type of professionalization, some type of licenses that make it difficult for other people to enter. So for instance, I think the text has the example of manure spreaders and of interior decorators in Florida that argued for licensing so as to essentially restrict the labor supply and preserve higher wages. All right, so licensing laws have the effect of restricting supply. Other things equal, that drives up wages. All right, so minimum wage laws, well, this also has an impact. This raises the wage above the equilibrium, and it's going to be beneficial for those who stay employed. You worry about those who lose their job, who become unemployed by virtue of having the minimum wage imposed. But to determine whether or not the minimum wage was a net benefit or a net loss, you'd have to look to see how are the gains to those who have kept their job and gotten a raise compared to the losses to those who have lost their job. And you really want to know something about like what's happened to those who have lost their job. Have they found some other job? And so on and so forth. And so it's a complex issue, but there's some interesting things beyond just observing that the higher wage is going to lead to some fewer jobs. Okay, so in terms of the occupational licensing, well, here's the supply and demand graph that reinforce this. So here would be the original labor supply, and then suppose there's a licensing requirement that restricts the number of people who are able to work in this field. Well, there's going to be a decrease in supply, a reduction in the number of individuals supplying their labor. So that'd be a leftward shift. Other things equal, it'll tend to increase the wage. Right? By decreasing the labor supply, licensing requirements raise the wage of those who are actually successful in obtaining a license. The minimum wage story, it's a price floor. It's a binding price floor if it's above the equilibrium. What this does is it says, this is going to be the lowest price for labor in this market. Now we can look and see what's going to be the impact by finding what's the quantity demanded, the labor demand, the number of jobs offered is going to be right here at the minimum wage versus over here at the equilibrium. And then what's the labor supply, or what's the quantity supplied of labor? Well, it's way out here. Now, that comparison is what gives us this unemployment. This is a surplus in the labor market. That's a little bit misleading, though, to say, this minimum wage created this unemployment, because what we really care about are those who have lost their jobs, right? So here's the quantity of labor in the equilibrium, and then here's the quantity of labor with the minimum wage. And so this portion of the bracket corresponds to disemployment, workers who have lost their job as a result of the imposition of the minimum wage. So I don't know, at least for me, I feel differently about those workers who have lost a job versus these workers right here, this other side of the bracket, who didn't have a job at the equilibrium price. They weren't like seeking a job, right? Because their opportunity cost, right? The marginal height of the supply curve is their marginal cost, their opportunity cost, their marginal cost of working was above the benefit, right? And so they didn't want to work at the previous equilibrium price. Now at this more lucrative price, they're entering the labor market, but they're unsuccessful. And so to the extent that there's individuals that are joining the labor market for this particular job who weren't willing to work at the lower wage, I might feel a little bit differently about their inability to find employment than those who have lost a job, right? And then to determine, what's the overall effect, you'd want to consider the gains, the producer surplus, the area under the price and above the supply curve for those who keep their job versus the loss of producer surplus, the area under the price and then above the supply curve for those who have lost their job. All right. So the minimum wage, yep, it's the lowest hourly wage that employers can pay. At this price floor, the quantity supplied of labor is higher than the quantity demanded, as I demonstrated, and a surplus in the labor market is what we call unemployment. And disemployment is specifically those who lost a job. Other interesting institutional factors, well, unions and workers' bargaining power. So individual workers don't have very much bargaining power, but joining into a union boosts the bargaining power through collective bargaining, so that the employer has to deal with one large group rather than a bunch of decentralized individuals. And so this can raise wages and can make businesses more productive. So here's the labor supply with unions. It's a reduced labor supply. Why? Well, because you have to be a member of the union to be able to take this job. And so the old labor supply, this is the number of workers who the firm, presumably the way that the contract has worked or whatever is the case, aren't able to hire apart from those who are members of the union. Other things equal, we expect the wage to rise. Employment probably falls. And then overall, productivity could rise if we end up having, unions are going to have a lot of different type of professionalizing efforts and activities and things that are going to be useful for productivity. All right. Other institutional factors, well, monopsony power is relevant, right? So monopoly is a single seller, right? A monopsony with an S is a single buyer. Right, so a union, part of the reason why the union's effective is because it essentially becomes a little bit of a monopoly, right? A single seller of labor. You have the employer dealing with a union rather than dealing with individuals. Well, suppose you have one major buyer of labor, right? You have like one factory in a small town or a small county or whatever. That factory probably has monopsony power. It's a single buyer of labor. There's very few alternatives in some areas apart from working for that particular employer. Other things equal, we'd expect this would be bad for wages. Monopsony power is going to reduce wages. Why? Because if this is the only employer, they don't have to compete with other employers for workers, and they what they can do is they can lower wages, and they can say, well, you're going to work for this company, or you'd have to move. And if the costs of moving or commuting are really high, people are just going to accept the low wages. And so that's the problem with monopsony power, right? Monopsony power is a business using its bargaining power as a major buyer of labor to pay lower prices, including lower wages. All right. Lower prices would be like lower prices for other inputs. If you're a monopsony buyer of what are the ingredients for whatever is the final good you're producing. Monopsony power affects whether the minimum wage hurts employment. Well, the idea with monopsony power is if you have this sort of artificially low wage, you could have a situation where as the minimum wage is raised, the wage could rise and overall employment could rise as well. If the minimum wage has this effect of sort of counterbalancing the monopsony. Name a company you think has been a monopsony of labor. Do you think it benefited or harmed from minimum wage a lot? Well, think about like in a small town, if you have only one employer or one major employer, that'd be kind of an example. Minimum wage creates unemployment because, well, it's a price floor and therefore creates a surplus of labor if it's binding, right? It needs to be binding to be able to cause a surplus. If it's a non-binding price floor, that'd be like a minimum wage below the equilibrium. It would have no effect on the market. But a minimum wage creates unemployment when it's a binding price floor. Okay. Now we'll talk about discrimination and then personnel economics, right? So by discrimination, we mean treating of people differently based on characteristics like gender, race, ethnicity, sexual orientation, religion, disability, and social class. Differences in wages across groups may be at least partly due to discrimination. If one group enjoys less success than another group in the labor market, it's not necessarily evidence of discrimination, right? I mean, so here's the data here: median weekly earnings in 2018 by sex and by race and ethnicity. Median means the middle, so half the data are above, half the data are below. In this case, half the weekly earnings are higher, half the weekly earnings are lower than, say, 973 in one group, 796 in another, 915 in another, 686 in another, 1,128 in another group, and then in the last group, 689. These are the midpoints. Half the data is higher, half the data is lower within that group. That's what median means. Okay. So we have, so there's differences in the median weekly earnings. So These differences may be at least partially due to discrimination. So what this means is, so when there's a gap like this, it's certainly absolutely suggestive of discrimination, and therefore really concerning. So then what economists want to do is come up with a way to be able to decompose and determine how much of that gap is unattributable to other sort of innocuous effects, right? And so what you can do is you use what's called decomposition methods. So my professor at the University of Arizona, Ron Oaxaca, was sort of pioneering some of these decomposition methods. Matter of fact, the technique bears his name. So it's the Blinder Oaxaca decomposition, sometimes just Oaxaca decomposition. I like to just say Oaxaca decomposition because he was my professor. Matter of fact, when I was in my first year in the PhD program, I was reading through the PhD level econometrics book we had. Is William Green's book, and I was reading through the passage, paging through, and I saw Oaxaca decomposition. And I was like, wait a second, that's the name on that door right next to my carrel. And sure enough, that was the first time that ever happened to me, where, you know, here is the person who's created like this thing that's being talked about in this textbook, and that's where they sit, like right next to me. That was so cool. That's why I like to call it the Oaxaca decomposition, as it did in the textbook. But anyway, the basic idea, though, is what these decomposition methods do is kind of separate out, you know, all the explainable factors, and then whatever amount of the gap. So you see these gaps here. Whatever amount of the gap can't be explained by innocuous factors. And of course, there's the issue that some of the things that you'd be controlling for, some of those factors like levels of education, years on the job, type of job, so on and so forth, like many of those things might be impacted by discrimination. Right? And so this is a really complex problem, you know, both from the standpoint of economists trying to determine the size of discrimination, but also from the standpoint of society trying to come up with ways to rectify these gaps. Okay, so anyway, whatever part is unexplained would then be attributable to discrimination. And the value of that type of method then is, well, it gives researchers, economists, policymakers, sociology, and so on and so forth, a starting point to go and look and see, oh, well, here is where we need to look to find, you know, what's, you know, where is discrimination entering, and then what can be done about it. Okay, so in terms of measuring discrimination, this kind of provides some background about what I was talking about. Wage gaps happen for many reasons. And accounting for differences in human capital and job characteristics explains some of the gap. That said, right, sometimes the differences in human capital and other characteristics very well might be impacted themselves by discrimination. But anyway, so after having taken into consideration a lot of these other sort of observable factors, then the remaining differences may reflect discrimination or other unobserved influences, but is really suggestive of discrimination. And discrimination might also be at the occupational level, right, leading some entire occupations to be underpaid. And so, you know, that's an entirely different issue itself. Now we want to talk about identifying the different types of discrimination. So there's prejudice, implicit bias, and then statistical discrimination kind of defined in the text. So by prejudice, well, we have a preconceived bias against a group that's not based on reason or experience. By implicit bias, we have judgments shaped by the unconscious attribution of particular qualities to specific groups. And by statistical discrimination, we have using observations about the average characteristics of a group to make inferences about the individual, right? And so, like, each of these differ in terms of like where they would enter into the employment picture, especially like relative to answering our question of how can employers reduce or eliminate discrimination. Well, I mean, prejudice is, so wouldn't say easy to deal with, but look, it's illegal, right? And so it's like something that's maybe a little bit easier to be able to identify relative to, for instance, implicit bias and statistical discrimination. And relative to like the employer that's trying to reduce or eliminate discrimination in their own practices, well, one of the issues, as research is suggesting, is that, well, you could have employers, you can have individuals who are meaning well, are trying to act in good faith, and are recognizing that they're not overtly prejudiced. However, they might ignore the fact that there's still implicit bias present, and that there's still statistical discrimination present. And so these last two, implicit bias and statistical discrimination, are a little bit more pernicious, a little bit more difficult to be able to kind of identify, especially like when you're thinking about from the standpoint of like economic evidence. You've got data and you're trying to be able to identify the places that discrimination is entering and exactly what's the cause. Well, some of those some is a little bit easier to be able to find in data than others, which makes it difficult from the standpoint of, well, society trying to eliminate discrimination and employers trying to eliminate discrimination. I think probably like some of the best advice for employers is to like take a really careful perspective on hiring practices, and to try to, as best as possible, eliminate all the potential places where discrimination could enter. And I think probably for this, the best model is like the gold standard for research, which is like a double-blind study, right? Then there's no experimenter effects. There's no expectations from subjects and expectations from researchers contaminating what you're trying to find. Well, as much as possible, you want to do something like that in the hiring process, where you've got a situation where individual characteristics, don't enter in a sort of disproportionate way to the hiring practices. And so, there's a lot of kind of different ways through kind of changing interview processes, having files sort of stripped of identifying data, and so on and so forth, and having several different sorts of checks and balances. Those are kind of some of the ways that employers can reduce or eliminate discrimination. I think also probably listening to workers, and surveys and so on and so forth, because even within HR, who hopefully has a pretty good grasp on how hiring practices are working, it's easy to, I think especially in the case of like implicit bias and statistical discrimination, I think it's an area that can kind of easily be overlooked, and ought not be, right? Okay, so if an employer infers an individual is more or less suited to a particular job based on the individual's gender, the employer is exhibiting which type of discrimination? Well, this is saying implicit bias. I'm actually kind of leaning a little bit more towards statistical discrimination. Let's go back to these definitions. So judgment shaped by unconscious attribution of particular qualities. I didn't see anything in the statement of this question that was invoking anything unconscious. It seems like this seems like based on individuals. Yeah, it doesn't. And so we're inferring that an individual is more or less suited based on, this seems like statistical discrimination. Yeah, using observations about the average characteristics of a group to make inferences about an individual. That seems way closer. I think this one's wrong. I don't think this is the correct answer. I think this should be statistical discrimination. Yeah. What do you think? I think I'm right. Okay, so lastly, personnel economics. Learn how smart employers get their workers to do more with less. All right. So how do you get workers to do more with less? Why don't we try to get them to do more with more? I don't know. Okay, fine. Ensure workers have the right skills for the job. That's important. And if they don't, then provide the adequate training. Yes. Motivate staff with incentives. Yes. Shape corporate culture. Yes. Offer the right benefits package. Yep. Attract and retain better workers. Those are all good advice. All right. So we're going to ensure workers have the right skills. So this is interesting for the standpoint of training. Well, you could invest in general skills or invest in job specific skills. So general skills are important. They make a more well-rounded employee, but on the other hand, they might take that well-rounded ability and apply it to some other field, some competitor, at least for their labor, and possibly a competitor directly. All right, so what about job-specific skills? Well, that's good. It's useful only in one particular job. This is essentially a relationship-specific investment. Relationship-specific investment is this investment that's useful only in the context of whatever is the employment relationship or whatever is the relationship. So that's that's the economic concept kind of behind this. This is interesting. Look, other things equal, I think it's probably good to invest in, like, the advice here is, like, if you want to make sure that the workers are only going to use their skills for improving productivity in that particular employment relationship, and then you want to raise the costs of them leaving, then you want to provide only job specific skills. But I don't think that's the best advice for the employer. I think what you want to do is you want to make sure, I would, for sure you want to have the skills to do the specific job, but you also want to have some improved general skills as well. And I would classify, for instance, some of the employers that'll offer like tuition remission packages as, like, so Starbucks famously was working with ASU Online, and some other, I think, look, this is sort of general skills, and I think there's reasons other than just the sort of narrowly focused economic advice to invest in employees more generally. But okay. Anyway, so personnel strategy number 2, motivate workers with incentives. How can managers motivate workers to remain on track? Well, better pay for better performance. To the extent that whatever is that performance is observable, reward good decisions, not just hard work, right? So reward competency, essentially. Use both rewards and punishment. Be wary. Incentives can distort effort. Incentives distort effort because what's the problem is people focus on whatever it is that's going to get them that reward, maybe to the detriment of the company more generally if they're avoiding other. So think of like a sales relationship, right? And so things that are going to be useful for generating sales might not be useful for like retaining customers, though. Like, you suppose part of the job description might be making new sales and then some type of existing customer service. Well, if you're only being paid for sales commission, you're only going to invest your time in new sales and then sort of neglect the customer service aspect. So that can be kind of a problem, and that's important for the employer to think about, is like, what's the incentive structure that people are going to be reacting to. Corporate culture is important. So we have extrinsic motivation, which is the desire to do something for the external reward, and intrinsic motivation, desire to do something for the enjoyment of the activity itself. Other things equal, you want to probably find a career where you're going to have some intrinsic motivation, right? The extrinsic motivation is important, right? You should look at the BLS, Bureau of Labor Statistics Occupational Outlook Handbook, and find the salary outlook for your prospective career and those near to it. And that's important because other things equal, it's better to be paid more, and other things equal, it's better to be into a more remunerative field, because extrinsic motivation is important because, people, we need money for things such as like living and then retirement and so on and so forth. On the other hand, the other aspects of the job are really important. Intrinsic motivation, you want to do something that you're enjoying. You don't want to do something that you absolutely hate for your entire working career. Also, you want to, from the standpoint of employers though, you want to generate a corporate culture that's based on shared values with the corporation, with the employees, and that can boost morale and then as well productivity. Let's see. So another relative to like corporate culture is interesting. So I think it was Zappos used to offer a $5,000 buyout package at the end of new employee training. What they wanted to do is generate new workers who would buy into their corporate culture of delivering wow, I believe, to their customers. And if you went through the training and you weren't fully bought in, you weren't fully invested in it, you could take $5,000 and then get a new job. And this was really important for Zappos. And I think Amazon bought Zappos and now does something really similar, where if really all that you're looking for is this quick paycheck or money for a specific need or whatever, and you're not that interested in that particular job or providing good customer service or whatever, that's a really good way for the company to get people to self-select out. As a matter of fact, it's probably cheaper in the long run. Think about that. If you're able to offer $5,000 to have a worker who's going to accept that $5,000 buyout to not work for the company, you've probably saved yourself as a company more than $5,000 on that worker, because that person wasn't going to be very productive. They weren't going to be very happy in that position. They might have given bad customer service. Other things equal, that could have cost more in the long run. So that's why I think that's why I mentioned it. I think it's sort of a brilliant incentive, brilliant screening mechanism. All right, personnel strategy offer the right benefits package. So your ability to attract productive workers depends on the entire compensation package, not just the salary. So, thinking about things like the different types of amenities at work, thinking about childcare, thinking about transportation, all these different sorts of things are really important. Employers have thinking about buying into things that the employer is able to buy at scale for employees rather than just employees buying themselves, such as if you have an in-house childcare or health insurance, obviously, and so on and so forth. So that's important, and that's one of the reasons why it could be one of the questions is, who's the most efficient buyer of something that people need to have? Maybe at the corporation level, maybe at the individual level. Compliments can help provide things that are complements to productivity, like free coffee in the office. Substitutes can hurt. Maybe you have too many ping pong tables or video game consoles or whatever. I don't know. So the idea is you want to provide complements to productivity, not substitutes to productivity. Attracting the best workers. Before implementing personnel policies, think about the type of worker you want to attract and retain. This is like the Zappos strategy, right? Thinking about coming up with, this is even before this, right? Trying to think about who you're trying to attract, who you're trying to recruit to this particular position. Match your personnel strategy to their values, right? And basically, you want to be able to get the best workers to want to work there and continue to work. Retaining is really important, right? Retaining happy workers and good workers. All right, so what are some examples of the types of personnel that different strategies will attract? I don't know. So you could think of which type of workers, I guess, are going to self-select into each of these different strategies. Okay. Good question. All right. So which of the following these are the slides that come. So the reason why I'm using these slides, of course, are because we have this weird sort of asynchronous version of the class. And I think it's really important that there's consistency between the lectures and then the readings and the slides. And so that's why I've chosen to go this way. Ordinarily, I've got my slides, and sometimes you see them in my old intermediate or introductory micro playlist. You have the slides that I'd usually teach with. Usually I'd put those up, but then most of the lectures on the board, sort of writing out things fresh, which absolutely does not work in this format. But anyway, so that's usually how I'd want to run the class, but that's not possible here. And I didn't want to just give you those slides or those old videos because they don't match the Stevenson and Wolfers text, and I want to it's really important to me that I minimize the instances of confusion for students. And so hopefully I've been successful. Okay. Which of the following might, despite the trade-offs of using the slides. All right. So which of the following might decrease your employees' productivity? Pay employees an hourly wage instead of based on the number of completed tasks. Yeah, so if you pay an hourly wage, this can decrease productivity rather than if the number of completed tasks. So I've got a story for this. So I used to work at an amusement park, Bay Beach in Green Bay, Wisconsin, and I was paid $5.61 an hour to tear tickets and let people go down this really big slide and make cotton candy and snow cones. And then later on, I was paid a little bit more. I was up to $7 an hour to run rides, Ferris wheel, train, or whatever is the case. I was paid an hourly wage, which meant it didn't matter how many people went down the ride or how many snow cones I made or whatever was the case. I was going to get paid the same, whether there's one person or thousands. And so I didn't work much harder than I had to, right? I mean, I wanted to keep the job because it was at the amusement park. It was right along the Bay of Green Bay, which is kind of one of the better jobs in the city, relative to like, high school and college kids. And so that's exactly what I wanted to do. But look, I would have worked a lot harder, a lot faster. I would have been a much better worker if I was paid. Well, better work. That's hard to say. If I was paid for the number of tickets that I tore for people going on the rides or number of snow cones that I made, I would have been a lot more productive at least. I don't know. So we would decrease the productivity if you're paying an hourly wage instead of conditioned on the performance. All right. And these other things actually would increase productivity. All right, so the summary slide. Employers look for signals of human capital and use efficiency wage to promote productivity. Differences in job characteristics lead to compensating differentials, such as my Bay Beach example. Licensing laws, minimum wage laws, unions, and monopsony help explain why wages vary. Prejudice, implicit bias, statistical discrimination contribute to wage differentials. Employers should train their workers, provide incentives, improve corporate culture, and offer the right benefits, attract and retain better workers to improve workers' productivity. All right, these are the kind of the key takeaways. I don't know, these are always kind of like a nice sort of like one like note card or note sheet, or I don't know, just like print off the slide, I guess, to kind of summarize what was important from that lecture. And then what you want to do is, of course, like go back and reinforce each of the concepts with the respective definition. But anyway, hope you enjoyed the video. I'm going to go ahead and conclude here. I'll see you in the next one.